All right, from the political perspective, this right here, this exchange between Matt Gaetz and Adam, some would call Schiff for brains. The banter back and forth here is pretty interesting. You've got Adam Schiff wanting to add an amendment to a bill which says that we need to lower the barrier of immigration because the people who are trying to immigrate here are trying to escape political or otherwise persecution from their country, and we don't need to tie that up because the longer they wait, the more chance for, say, Venezuelan or Mexican gangs to get to them while they're waiting and kill them. And Matt Gaetz has a clarifying question, which they argue about. So let's just get into this. This is really interesting.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is simple. It would exempt individuals fleeing communist and totalitarian regimes from Section 104. We should exempt people fleeing communist and totalitarian dictatorships from this legislation and allow them to apply for asylum as our laws were intended. The underlying bill would bar individuals who cross the border between ports of entry from seeking asylum. This means individuals would be forced to wait in Mexico to cross the border and be processed. That would make people fleeing communist and totalitarian regimes sitting ducks for the cartels for exploitation, abuse, kidnapping, or murder.
So communist and totalitarian regimes is what Matt Gaetz is going to ask Adam Schiff for brains to clarify and qualify.
We have seen what happens when people are forced to wait in Mexico for too long. Under the Remain in Mexico program, there were over 1,500 publicly reported cases of murder, rape, torture, kidnapping, and other violent assaults against migrants returned under the Remain in Mexico program. In fact, just last month, we saw what happens when vulnerable migrants are put at risk, when migrants in an immigration center in Ciudad Juarez were left to be burned alive. This is not the fate we want for anyone, and we don't want people fleeing totalitarian dictatorships like people fleeing Venezuela or Cuba or Nicaragua or Russia or China or Vietnam or elsewhere to have to face those kind of dangers. There was a time when my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claimed to oppose communism and totalitarian dictatorships and welcomed people fleeing those horrible regimes. The underlying bill suggests otherwise. I urge my colleagues to join in this amendment so that those fleeing asylum are not put at those fleeing persecution by these communist regimes are not put at additional risk by having to wait for long periods of time in dangerous places before they can lawfully apply for asylum.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Will you yield for the clarifying question?
You can seek your own recognition. I'm going to yield back to the chair.
The gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman seek recognition?
I guess so.
The point of order is withdrawn, and Mr. Gaetz is recognized.
Thank you. I yield to the sponsor. If the sponsor would be willing to engage in a colloquy with me, would you consider the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to be a totalitarian dictatorship?
Mr. Gaetz, I give the same answer that Representative Lofgren gave before. These are not new terms of art. These are the terms used in current law. And so we are merely applying current law to protect people, and in particular, in this case, those that are fleeing communist dictatorships. If the gentleman, his objection is that this definition is overbroad.
No.
You yielded to me.
I'm asking you a clarifying.
I don't know why Adam Schiff doesn't just answer the question. It's a very simple question. It seems like it would just demand a straightforward answer, not all this banter back and forth. But it gets heated. Stay tuned.
If you would yield, if you would respond to my question, which is, if this amendment is narrowed to communist dictatorships, will you support it?
Well, again, Mr. Schiff, I'm just trying to understand what your
amendment says. I guess your answer is no, then, Mr. Gaetz.
Well, that you perhaps assume too much, my friend.
Your answer
because
is yes.
I'm asking what you mean by totalitarian dictatorship and just whether the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia would qualify. It's just a yes or no question.
Well, I certainly think.
Forgive me for not knowing the list that Ms.
Would you like an answer, Mr. Gaetz? I certainly consider Saudi Arabia to be a dictatorship. Yes, I do.
A totalitarian one?
Mr. Gaetz, my question is.
Now, he answered the question. This is weird to me. Adam Schiff for brains, no matter what you think of him, did answer the question that he believes Saudi Arabia is a dictatorship, but then Matt Gaetz asks an authoritarian dictatorship. Now, there's very little difference or nuance between a dictatorship and an authoritarian dictatorship. And Saudi Arabia could probably best be described as, and I think most people understand it as, an authoritarian monarchy rather than a classic dictatorship. But the bottom line is, it is a stern authoritarian structure because you have the framework of royal rule rather than it being under a single autocrat. So let's listen to some more of this. It's interesting how they're kind of dissecting words here, and questions aren't being asked flat out, even though the original question was finally addressed. But then there's a further clarifying question. Really, really bizarre stuff.
If your problem with this amendment is you think it's
Mr.
overbroad...
Schiff, I'm not stating a problem with the amendment. I am merely asking you what it means.
My question then, Mr. Gaetz, is
what is the difference between a dictatorship and a totalitarian dictatorship?
My question...
That's a good question. That's a good question. What's the difference between a dictatorship, just a regular, average, run-of-the-mill, five-and-dime dictatorship, and an authoritarian dictatorship?
Saudi Arabia is a
there is a difference between totalitarianism and dictatorship.
Well, sure, I'm asking you to explain the differences of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia.
That's really the question, Mr. Gaetz.
Why can't you just answer whether or not your amendment would apply to them?
Mr. Gaetz, this is just a rhetorical exercise.
It's a serious effort to understand whether or not your amendment applies to the kingdom.
If your question is sincere, which I know assumes too much, but if it is, then will you support the amendment confined to communist dictatorships? Yes or no, Mr. Gaetz?
I'm probably not going to support the amendment either way. That
well,
doesn't
there you go.
I don't want to know what it means.
Then what about all the rhetoric you constantly espouse about standing up to communism? Here you're saying someone fleeing communism, if they're interdicted between ports, then they will not qualify.
Right,
doesn't matter what kind of regime.
There is a mechanism by which one seeks asylum for those very reasons, and it's not showing up and creating an entire loophole in the asylum
So this whole thing about Saudi
system.
Arabia is just a red herring, right?
I'm just curious to know whether or not you consider them qualifying under the bill.
Your curiosity,
and I have burned 2.5 minutes.
Consistency.
Mr. Schiff, people on the border don't get to have a debate like this, like you and I do. It's not your time, Mr. Schiff. I'm reclaiming my time.
Mr. Gaetz has the time. Mr. Gaetz has the time.
You do.
Mr. Gaetz has the time.
Look, on the border, someone doesn't get to have this joyful little colloquy with you. A Border Patrol agent has to look at someone and assess whether or not they're going to let them in or not. And I'm just, for clarity, even though I'm not going to support your amendment, I'm going to support the bill. In the unlikely event that your amendment were to be adopted, I simply want to know if someone encounters someone from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, whether or not the exception that your amendment affords would allow that or not.
Well, as I said, I'm using the existing definition, Mr. Gaetz. My
So
question
does
to
that
you
definition
is,
include the
my
kingdom or
question
not?
to you is, will
This
you
is insane.
live
This is
up to
insane.
your
You just have to answer the
anti-communist rhetoric?
question,
Will
Mr.
you
Schiff.
live up to your anti-communist rhetoric, or is it just a lot of talk from you, Mr. Gaetz?
I don't think you have to blow a hole through the
it's
asylum
just
system to
a lot
oppose
of
communism.
talk. I guess it's just a lot of talk with you. Nothing more than a lot of empty
I just want to know
talk.
if the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is included or excluded. How is this so difficult for you?
Well,
Do you have any compassion for the people who would have to make this assessment on the border? I just want to know.
Would you care for me to read the code section to you?
Gladly.
The existence of a single political party organized on a dictatorial basis with so close an identity between such party and its policies and the government policies of the country in which it exists, and the party and the government constitute an indistinguishable unit, and the forcible suppression of opposition to such party. That is how the code currently defines a totalitarian party
would you define Saudi
and a
Arabia that way or not?
totalitarian dictatorship.
Would you define them that way or not, Adam?
So if you wanted to know, read the code. But the question
would you
is
apply
not,
to them or not?
the
It's your
question is
amendment.
not whether you can read the code. The question is
wrote the
whether you
amendment,
stand
and you
for
can't say
anything,
whether it
Mr.
applies
Gaetz.
to a specific
The question
country.
is,
It does seem like it's a simple answer, yes or no answer. Just, Adam Schiff, you're bringing this amendment to the floor. Answer the question, does your amendment apply to people seeking asylum from Saudi Arabia? Just yes or no.
do you
Why does this
stand?
pain you so
do you
much?
stand for anything? Does anything you say mean anything
I
to you?
merely am seeking your
Are
own
you
ability
really
to define
so
your own
soft?
amendment.
Are you really so soft on communism now, Mr. Gaetz? I am shocked.
Soft on communism?
So
You're soft on definitions
you would
within your own bill.
You would prosecute.
Soft on the basics of the English language. Soft on the interpretation statute mechanisms by which a Border Patrol agent would have to apply this.
They won't.
You know what? A Border Patrol agent isn't going to have this.
Mercifully, the gentleman is out of time. Mercifully, the gentleman is out of time. Okay. Woo.
Should we have unanimous consent to continue?
No, everybody's out of time. Everybody's out of time.
I just think that was really interesting. The heated banter back and forth between definition of terms and simply asking a question whether this amendment applies to people that are coming from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and just all of the tax dollars and the time and the money that these congressmen and senators are actually making, the base congressman making $174,000 per year, to yield this kind of result right here is pretty sad. So if you haven't done so already, subscribe to this channel. Let me know what you think about this bantering back and forth. What do you think that Schiff should have just answered the question? Do you think it was unreasonable for Gaetz to have that question? What is really going on here? Is this the proper use of time for people who are supposed to be, protecting and serving America? Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification icon, give it a thumbs up, share it with everybody you know. Don't forget to subscribe to my email list through my website, highimpactflix.com, and I will see you in the next video.